I thought what we would do with this panel, and we'll get to introductions in a second, is just provide a moment to kind of culminate maybe at a higher level on some of the themes that we've seen in both this morning's panel among practitioners and also among our papers. So I have some high level questions to start people with. But before we get there, maybe we just go down the row and a quick intro.
Sure. Hi, I'm John Newman. I'm currently a professor at the University of Miami School of Law, but recently spent some time at the Federal Trade Commission, overseeing, among other things, I think all of their big tech cases. So you heard Diana earlier say she was being the devil's advocate when she was defending the Microsoft Activision case. That makes me the devil with that.
I'm Brooke Smith. I am a visiting professor at ASU Law School. I spent about 10 years in practice before transitioning into academics. Have been on both sides of antitrust cases, but most recently was at a plaintiff's boutique, primarily representing state enforcers in big tech antitrust cases.
I'm Diana Moss. I am VP and Director of Competition Policy at the Progressive Policy Institute. We're a sort of center-left thinking think tank. Before that, I was the president of the American Antitrust Institute, and before that, a federal regulator. And before that, I was in private practice in litigation. I'm also an adjunct professor at the University of Colorado at Boulder in the economics department.
Nice. Yeah. Everyone, I thought one of the things we heard a lot today is about the tech industry and competition policy as it relates to that. And I thought I would just ask. This is a very broad question to start with, so maybe particularly suitable for all of us academics. But the question is the following. So in my work, I study the financing of technological development and innovation networks. And if you look back historically to the early 20th century, things like the financing of airplane development and that technology is sort of a classic example. And it often strikes me, while there are similarities over time, it's like a very different world that existed back then compared to some of the markets we have today. So that's around the time, and we can draw antitrust antecedents prior to the early 20th century, of course, but modern competition law is sort of born in that era. And the question is simply, is it flexible enough to address heterogeneity across all these markets, or do we really are really what we're talking about our market or industry specific competition policies? And just what your thoughts are and experiences are around that. And we can keep on going down the line, and then we'll turn it up and we'll come back down the line.
All right. So I think Richard Posner famously said in a 2000 law review article written in the year 2000, he said, antitrust law is, quote, supple enough to deal with these new economy markets. I think generally that's still right. I think the laws that we have, at least in theory, are enough, or they are quite general, right? Most of them. They're pretty broad. They're meant to be pretty aggressive when you read some of the language, like in Clayton Act Section 7, kind of the big one hanging over our discussion today, right? Which specifically targets mergers and acquisitions. Man, you find me another statute that says something is illegal if it may cause a certain effect like that. That's Congress being pretty aggressive. And the way that they ended up with that language was they originally had made this a criminal statute. And then some people in Congress were like, that's too aggressive. But the trade-off was, okay, we'll dial it back so that a merger doesn't have to cause these effects. We'll give up on the criminal prohibition, but we want a really aggressive statute. If it's going to be civil, we want it to reach really, really far. So these laws we have are like pretty far-reaching. I think if they're applied in a kind of faithful way to what Congress really meant them to do, yeah, I think we've got all the tools we would need to deal with any of the problems that have surfaced today. What I came back from the FTC feeling especially depressed about, though, was judges. I think we've got the laws. I'm not sure we've got the judges who are going to apply those laws. So I read cases like AT&T Time Warner, United Health Change, and I just don't see judges who are willing to faithfully use these tools.
It's very, very similar to my perspective. We've got one sentence statutes. It's hard to get more broad, more nimble than that. But the common law has developed over the time since then, interpreting those laws. We have a long period of time with significant Chicago school influence over the common law. There are those who think that was the right direction and the right interpretation. There are those who don't, and there's only so much you can do now, especially when you have law created by the Supreme Court that constrains what we can do with those statutes. There are other places like the merger guidelines. Those can change more frequently. They can be a reflection of policy objectives to the extent they're consistent with the interpretation of the common law. However, you have to think, if they change constantly, will they become less significant to judges as they interpret the laws? So not as nimble, as sort of constantly evolving. But I think the original laws are nimble. I think the common law is less so, and that's where I am interested in. Do we need some regulation to unwind some of the common law that we are stuck with and is difficult to deal with, either because it is no longer economically well-founded, but we can't change it because it's embedded in the law, or because some cases are just like, we'll talk about platform markets a little bit. It is unfortunate that we are stuck with Amex, but we are.
Well, I'm going to try and, be a flamethrower at least at some point on this panel, but I will agree that, our antitrust laws are pretty solid, and it's generalist law enforcement, right? These laws apply across industries. They apply across, different production models. We have a pretty sound theory of how consumers behave, consumer theory. So I think up until recently, things have hung together pretty well. I would say maybe the biggest challenge right now, or at least a good example of a challenge to sort of, is antitrust, does it have the chops to take on new stuff, especially in the tech sector, would be the algorithmic collusion cases, for example, in RealPage. And we are all waiting with bated breath to see what the courts hand down on that. What I will say is this: I think you have to look at it from three perspectives. The law is the law, and I think the law is sound. And economics are economics, and we all know about unique economic features like market failures, network effects, data externalities, information asymmetries that are just pervasive in the tech sector. But I think what we don't have a good grip on antitrust-wise is different business models, right? So antitrust. So now you go to the business schools, especially the marketing literature, which is really important and useful in antitrust, I have found. And antitrust was really good with distribution channels, and then it took on vertical marketing channels, and then it took on business networks, and now it's taking on digital business ecosystems. But I think the boundaries of how we think about the firm are going to have to change, right? Sort of this neoclassical and embrace of the production function may have to change. I think we also are pressing on the boundaries of consumer behavior and what we understand to be gospel about how consumers behave, because we know in the digitals that consumers don't behave rationally. They understate their preferences for privacy. They don't follow their preferences for privacy. So I think if we look at business models, we look at economics, we look at the learning that comes out of the business schools, we're starting to press on the boundaries of whether antitrust can handle it all. And I think if we have to at least go outside the boundaries, because we have some clear examples where antitrust is failing to be generalist enough, then we're going to have to take up different policy tools, potentially sector regulation, or other policies. But I think we're really in the middle of that firestorm right now.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I'd like to come back to the question of sector regulation and the interaction, and I think we know like the traditional legal framework around that, but maybe to think a little bit more carefully about what the practical interaction is. But before we get there, maybe just to pull on a thread that John and Brooke shared, judges. Uh, what's the issue? And then what do you do about that?
What's wrong with judges?
You
uh,
don't have any here, so you can.
Yeah, okay. Chatham House rules, right? Well, judges have always been lower C conservative, just by nature, the kind of people who move through the right law schools, meet the right people, get connected enough politically to be named a federal judge. But they tend to be kind of lower C conservative. We can all probably think of a few exceptions, Rakoff, etc. But there are like two of them, right? When you look around the entire federal judiciary. So they've always been lower C conservative. And over time, as we're thinking about that kind of deep history that you started us out with, we've seen this over and over, right? Judges are super conservative. Congress says that's not what we meant when we enacted these antitrust laws, so they strengthen them. 1914, it's the Clayton Act. They create an entire new agency, the Federal Trade Commission, which is supposed to have its own judges who make their own law. That's how upset Congress was with the judiciary. And over time, that didn't work super well. So we get 1950, we strengthen the antitrust laws again. Courts walk it back again. So I think that firestorm Diana described it's not a new thing, right? In a way, I think judges have always been kind of conservative. To the extent it's worse now, it's probably, at least in part, the effect of like 40 years of Chatham House rules, brainwashing by the George Mason School and its kind of ecosystem. So it hasn't gotten better. I think it's gotten worse, in part because of some bad judicial training.
Okay. Okay.
I will say one observation I found in practice. I do think district court judges and lower court state judges are more willing to engage in fact-specific inquiries to the extent they can do so within the confines of precedent, because they're not creating precedent, right? And so if you have a case that's sort of down the middle of the existing law and the existing standards, common law standards. I have seen, at least, there's varying degrees of ability to engage with the technical specifics of some of these cases, but at least to the extent intellect permits, judges really engage with the specifics and try to get into the weeds. I think when you go to the appellate courts and the Supreme Courts, much less so. There are, they turn into more lower C conservative, but also political machines, and you see that in the outcomes of cases, and the facts become less important than the way in which they want to move the law or not move the law.
Yeah, I'm, again, district court judges in the United States are generalist judges. I've participated in and actually run judicial education programs when I was at AAI. And, John is not overstating it when he says that, the most consistently produced judicial education program is through George Mason, and they're getting a very, very conservative flavor of antitrust through that program. And as somebody who's pro enforcement, I've we started a movement to sort of push back on that and provide more sort of progressive judicial training. But it's definitely a difficult issue. I do think that. It's up to the agencies within the ambit of these very generalist antitrust laws to provide as much guidance as they possibly can to the judiciary, and that comes mostly through guidelines, amicus briefs, statements of interest, and I think going back to the first question that you asked, of course, is we may need a policy statement on digital on digital. As it applies generally to mergers and Section 1 concerns and monopolization concerns. We have guidelines on healthcare. Well, we used to; those were withdrawn. But we have guidelines on a lot of different stuff, and maybe that's a really good vehicle for helping judges along as they navigate through these choppy waters.
Yeah, no, thanks everybody. Maybe then to build a bridge to Dana, something you mentioned earlier, just about the interaction between antitrust law and a regulatory approach, like a sectoral approach. Any thoughts from the group on how that balance is achieved? I'll just leave it as an open question.
Well, I think it's a policy choice. The issues raised by the digitals are pretty significant because of all their economic anomalies and their very intricate, complex business model. We have to decide, as a matter of policy in the United States, that antitrust is unable to fix certain problems, or antitrust can only go so far in addressing certain problems. You have to kind of get to that point while considering these unique economic characteristics of the digitals in deciding, as a matter of policy, that we need to, for example, have a Digital Markets Act in the United States. I'm not saying that I support that, but it is entirely in a future scenario that we reach that fork in the road where antitrust can only tackle so much for what it's intended to do, and we need another policy tool. Right. And as a former sector regulator myself, I was at FERC for many years. That's what we did 24/7. We did conduct regulation because we were dealing with massive market failures like natural monopolies and, other things. So I think we who knows if we'll ever reach that point in the U.S. where we have to decide. Obviously, Europe has gone down their pathway. That's no success story, people, right? And we don't have a success story over here. And so, one paper I recently wrote is that we're searching for a competition policy for the digital sector, and nobody's really finding it for all the reasons why we've talked about today on this, in these great papers and other conversations.
I have to disagree. Well, go ahead first.
If you want to disagree
No,
with that,
I was going to
go for
disagree.
it.
Maybe you could disagree with me.
Sure, that'll
Okay.
be fun.
We have a little cartel. Well, I was just going to quickly note that I think we do have some success stories, and maybe we do have the competition policy out there. It's just in the consumer protection arm of the Federal Trade Commission. So like Lena made a lot of headlines for what she did on the antitrust side of the house, but they did some really interesting stuff on the consumer protection side of the house, including with rulemakings, right? It was kind of
Yep.
sectoral regulation. Those things used to take 5 years, start to finish. She got it down under 2. So it's just a much more like nimble side of the house these days and doing some, I think, pretty innovative stuff.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all, but I will say that the FTC remains very challenged in their ability to integrate the policy arms, the Bureau of Consumer Protection and the Bureau of Competition. Everybody's siloed out, never the twain shall meet. There needs to be some serious policy integration to address these issues, especially in the tech space.
I don't know if I disagree with either of you. So I'll just add something extraneous. It's certainly not unprecedented to displace antitrust authority to other agencies, FERC, FDIC, FCC. So that's certainly possible. But the examples that we see are much more well understood static markets. We understand the economic forces at play for the most part. FCC gets a little complicated if you think that they venture into the digital space. But for a lot of reasons that we've talked about today, digital markets, first of all, that's a huge term, right? What markets are we talking about when we talk about digital markets? The many different sectors in digital behave differently. So it's difficult to think of, to imagine an agency that could get its arms around digital and have a cohesive policy. Nor do I have a lot of confidence that that would happen right at this moment in time.
I think we're talking about the digital business ecosystems, the 3-part structure, the platform, the cloud, and then all the constellation of applications. That's where I think most of the market failures pop up, as opposed to at Oracle or Salesforce, for example.
So I think you can see potentially, and this is where it's not really industry specific, it's business model specific, right? We're talking about platform markets. Another area I could see some sort of specific regulation or confines around is AI. Because there are so many other societal interests in where that goes. I think where you get, or where you have maybe more leg to stand on entering into a regulatory scheme is we have a lot of other societal interests in this particular thing. We're worried about privacy. We're worried about the robots coming for us, whatever it is, and so we think that there are other reasons we might regulate this particular area.
Yeah, let's come back to that a little bit later in the panel, and maybe, but just maybe to pick on Brooke in particular as a starting point for this next one. So we've heard about agencies, we heard about judges, and I'm going to ask this out of a place of ignorance because my antitrust experience was largely isolated to M&A and some price fixing. But what about private litigants? Where do they sort of we sort of fleshed out this story of institutional complementarity over the last few minutes. Wh- where's it at? What role do you think it has to play going forward? I'm just
Uh,
picking on you, Brooke, because of your background.
Yeah. Private litigants follow the money. I don't. Chatham House rules. I don't personally think private litigants have a huge role to play in the shaping of policy and law. I think they tend to bring cases that they think they can win, especially if they're on contingency. And so they're going to bring cases that are sort of within the ambit of current law. And and yeah, they're going to bring cases that are going to make them a lot of money. And I don't think that necessarily aligns. Except for I represented state agencies,
Yeah.
that's a different structure, right?
Right. So maybe like a force
So
multiplier.
we can put a plug in if anyone wants to talk about mass arbs. That's also a different
Uh,
beast and has a lot of positive consumer effects. But if you think about just sort of the typical antitrust class action,
Hmm.
I'm going to roll that back a little bit. Shaping policy, not as much. Taking off some of the workload from the agencies, potentially. I think that they do have a role to play there.
Yeah, I'll push back against the follow the money comment. I think private antitrust enforcement is a critical part of a three-legged stool in the United States system. The private rights of action are imperatively important. Um, Private antitrust enforcers are seeking restitution for victims of antitrust crimes. And, I think 2023 data showed that about 95% of private cases are Section 1 price fixing or market allocation cases, which makes total sense, right? Private litigants don't approach Section 7 cases because there's no recovery involved, right? The mergers have not yet occurred. But in price fixing, market allocation, some small section of those cases are monopolization cases, Section 2 cases. But you can get relief out of private litigation that you can't get out of public civil litigation. Treble damages is think about optimal deterrence theory, right? Treble damages can actually make a company think twice about engaging in recidivist behavior where they do the crime again. So I think it's an important part of our system. I mean, we could have a whole nother panel on what's going on with the NCAA right now in that case, which I think is a disaster for the model of college sports in the United States. But and then of course, Brooke is absolutely right about the relationship between public and private enforcement. There are follow-on cases, there are reverse follow-on cases, so there is some teamwork involved, right, in this three-legged stool of enforcement in the U.S.
And I guess I would. I think the stats on Section 1 and Section 2 cases are, in my view, telling of a Section 1 case, particularly if you have a per se violation, is an easy case to bring, quick to recovery, easy case to prove. And so it makes a lot of sense that private litigants would bring those and bring those successfully more often, and is probably why with an enforcement policy that was lax on Section 2 and Section 2 cases being so difficult, the law sort of mounting against them, and them requiring a great deal of proof, we see less of them in private litigation, where I think from my perspective, it would have been helpful over the last 50 years had private litigants been bringing more Section 2 cases.
Yeah. And I mean, the standards for showing collusion are rising. They're not falling. I mean, it's hard to prove a collusion case nowadays without smoking gun evidence of a conspiracy. I mean, it's going in the opposite direction. The standards are going up. They're not going down, which I think doesn't bode well for the government's DOJ's case against RealPage. Not only is it a collusion case, but it is a digital case, which it kind of amps up, the complexity more generally.
Yeah, same for agri-stats. There's no such thing as an easy antitrust case
Right.
these days. I think that's right. Maybe just a couple points, I guess, on our private enforcer friends. One, I think it is helpful to distinguish between sort of class action model and the, I'm a deep pockets plaintiff. I believe in the principle. I'm thinking of people like Epic, right? They're bringing big, important cases. They may reshape a tech ecosystem
Yeah,
in the Google.
I would distinguish between essentially consumer and competitor cases.
Yeah, competitor, or I'm thinking too of like the Michael Jordan NASCAR lawsuit. Not really a competitor, but
Yeah.
it's a pretty good case. It's a big Section 2 case brought by a private litigant. Could reshape a not digital ecosystem. So yeah, I think that's a helpful
All right, I
distinction.
might have been too skeptical.
All right.
I take it back a little
Sweet.
bit. I'm jaded. What can I say?
Yeah, but and then maybe another point to we talked a little bit this morning about like why don't enforcers bring these like merger cases and B2B product markets? Well, at least part of the thinking while I was there was usually you've got pretty sophisticated customers. If Salesforce ends up getting harmed by a merger, and I've got scarce resources as a public enforcer, I think I'm going to let Salesforce protect themselves, right? So there, it does play a role as you're kind of doing your case selection as an enforcer.
Yeah, yeah. I'm gonna use something Brooke mentioned as like this is the small hole I'm gonna drive a bus through to try to maybe change the conversation a little bit. If everything we've talked about so far is what I would call sort of an institutional complementarity discussion or like an administrability discussion, maybe shifting back in a way back to our first panel today to talk a little bit about some overarching theories. And I'm going to pitch this one to you guys, but this is actually something I'd love to crowdsource some thoughts from everybody, just because I think this is new territory. So in the part of Washington I'm in these days, I hear a lot of interesting ideas and sometimes fever dreams about how the law can be retooled to achieve certain national security ends. So we see this in corporate law, for instance. Like fiduciary duties should be altered to fit these sort of nationalistic goals, and boards of directors would actually bear those duties. So my question is, how does that interact with the current environment and competition policy? Which, before I said any of those words, I would have said this has been a fascinating decade of intellectual foment in competition policy. Now, what do we do when we, taking the neo-Brandeisian challenge to what I'll just call the orthodoxy that at least I practiced when I left practice 10 years ago. Now we're put in this new thing, which is what I think I'll just summarize as saying, what we need, this is not my view, but the line I hear, what we need are essentially what we would call national champions to counter adversarial threats elsewhere in the world. And I think what that implicitly means is we should hit pause on antitrust enforcement. So the question is, what do you do with that? How does that work? And maybe what I'd love to hear is like, are we talking about this yet? Or is this sort of siloed in one part of Washington? And that's kind of a question for everybody too.
Yeah. Do we in cause antitrust enforcement during recessions when we're just trying to keep the industry alive? And like maybe looking should be otherwise in time.
Okay. Yeah. So maybe this is a cyclical thing also. Yeah.
So I guess maybe a couple thoughts on both provocations. I think my answer to both, my response to both would be we've already done both. When it comes to NatSec defense, we took a hands-off, create national champions approach for something like 30 plus years. The section at DOJ Antitrust Division that handled mergers in that space didn't litigate a case for I think 30 years. It was just merger after merger after merger, partly because defense was going to weigh in if they did try to challenge me and say, no, we need these companies to be massive, huge, powerful national champions. You would know the answer to this much better than I do, but my sense is that was not a great policy, right? It did not lead to an especially vibrant and resilient defense production ecosystem, right, in the U.S. And then as to recessions, we kind of did this during the Great Depression, right? Appalachian Coal's case came out of that. And for the first kind of 3 or 4 years or so of FDR's approach to the Great Depression, we were doing the opposite of antitrust, right? We were like encouraging cartels, trying to save industries. And that didn't work too well either, right? And then you saw Thurman Arnold come in totally different approach, aggressive antitrust. Hard to tease out the causation here, but I think that worked a lot better.
I would just, I think, add some thoughts around, what is the concept of the national security? How do we think about that in antitrust? I mean, obviously, there's the whole defense sector, and DOJ and FTC have deferred strongly to DOD. But where, as John says, where has that gotten us? It's gotten us a supply chain with a couple of, maybe two competitors at each major level: avionics, aircraft manufacturing, missile systems, you name it. I mean, look at SpaceX, right? And so, $13 billion in government contracts. So we have these very fragile supply chains in national security, but we also have them in healthcare. We also have them in food and agriculture. And I've argued in the past that having stable, resilient, flexible supply chains that can withstand a shock, an exogenous shock, like a pandemic or a hurricane or disease or some political event, really is part of a national security objective, right? I mean, if we have an unhealthy, unfed public, that is a national security concern. The question, I think, for antitrust is, how do you shoehorn that into the consumer welfare standard, right? I have a very flexible interpretation of the consumer welfare standard. It's not Lena Khan's interpretation, which is short-term price effects only. But by all means, the consumer welfare standard can approach price effects, non-price effects, innovation, i.e. innovation, quality effects. I think a merger that creates a market power bottleneck and a big supply chain that does pose a risk to national security and the health and safety of a population is absolutely approachable under a consumer welfare standard. I mean, it's sort of the epic quality effect. A breakdown in a supply chain means people don't eat or they don't get access to healthcare. I don't think we're there yet in terms of applying the consumer welfare standard. But my only other thought is, if we can't get to it through the antitrust tool, then we need other systems. We need other policy tools to do that. So, as a federal regulator, we had a public interest standard at FERC. We could approach the safety and reliability of the transmission grid. We could approach all sorts of stuff. And if that's what, is deemed to be important, then we'll need to deploy multiple policy tools.
Yeah. Maybe if I could just pull out the tension a bit, and I'm if anybody wants to jump in, by all means. So I think what's interesting in the conversations, at least that I hear, is an expansion on just like a defense sector type consideration, which I think is what you were talking about, Diana, which is, it's not just Raytheon and Boeing and Lockheed, but we're talking about a much bigger swath of the economy. Not hotel chains, but other things. And then how do you, how do you take that more expansive notion, which is a situation, if I'm tracking what we were discussing earlier, is something that a broad institution like antitrust is actually equipped to tackle, with a normative standard that, at least at first glance, seems different than consumer welfare. But I take your point that maybe it's not. Like, that's a lot. Yeah. So that's anyway. I appreciate that. Yeah, Rebecca.
I'm talking about industrial policies. I'm a little confused by the broader than the Department of Defense kind of contracts those suppliers. Do you mind just sharing a bit more? I'm not in Washington.
Yeah. Well, let's. So DoD's had industrial policy for decades now. Doing sort of what you would think, like making weapon systems, supporting that. As we think more broadly about vulnerabilities across the industrial base, then you just start to think about, maybe it's software, right? We have software dependencies. Maybe it's artificial intelligence, critical minerals, like all this stuff, right? It's just a lot broader than just missiles, kind of thing. So then. One thing we've done over the last 4 years, at least, and I think we'll continue to do in some respect, is lean into industrial policy. And I think the question is, do we actually have the fiscal capacity to do that in the future? Probably not. So then then what do you start looking at? That's just a so the idea that you could use consumer welfare as a tool in that toolkit, that's really interesting. Yeah, I don't know if that made any sense, Rebecca. Okay, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like really interested in privacy, which you were talking about earlier, like is it antitrust, can we apply consumer welfare standard to it? It seemed like a case where like the monotony angle actually is very important, or if, like your employer can like track all of your movements, maybe that's not, then maybe that's anti-competitive too. And there seems like it to be like, maybe they track all my data so they can get coupons, that's maybe fine, but like there's also at the same time have like all of my messaging, all of my personal communications are also, in the same category. And how to think about that as an antitrust, like consumer protection.
I can take this one. This is in my wheelhouse. um, that is absolutely within the ambit of antitrust from my perspective. I think if you look at the common law, we have traditionally focused on price effects. In part because they're measurable, and again, courts are lower seat conservative. They know what to do with them. I can see them. There is definitely precedent for quality effects, and I think most people would recognize or concede that quality effects should be included in consumer welfare. They're just difficult to measure. And I think privacy is a really good example of a quality effect, right? Does the whatever action, does the merger or does the potentially monopolistic action decrease privacy? And I think there are some metrics to show that, right? What was the state of the world before, and what was the state of the world after the intervention that decreased privacy, right? So yeah, and there are cases. There are cases moving forward on that theory, and there is some indication that that will be accepted by the courts. It's all context specific, as I think it should be, right? But for sure.
But
Yeah.
don't you think there's some potentially perverse outcomes? So just a hypo would be, okay, we decide we're going to break up Facebook into 5 little Facebooks. And at least one of those little Facebooks regrows to significant size because of network effects. And okay, so there's a market failure really showing its power. But then you think about the data side, because most of the harnessing of the value of consumer data in the digital ecosystems is done through algorithmic preference shaping, right? It's feeding suggestions to users to keep them in the ecosystem, to keep them from getting out of the ecosystem and switching to another ecosystem. So I think those two things work directly against each other, right? So even a small company that experiences significant network effects has strong incentives to abuse consumer data and hence data privacy. And so I've always struggled with that as an economist. It's like the battle of the market failures. and I think that's a problem.
And I think that's a good example of why antitrust is not the only tool, right?
There you go.
Antitrust can't fix all the
Exactly.
problems, and we should be approaching data privacy from all different angles, from the consumer protection angle, right? If any sort of this algorithmic preference shaping is deceptive or misleading, right? We should be attacking that from consumer protection, and then potentially regulation on data privacy. What are companies allowed to collect? What do they have to tell you before they collect? That's not really antitrust really
It's
isn't
not.
equipped to handle that.
It's not.
Particularly if there's not a market power problem. 100%
Agree.
Yeah. And yeah, Daisy.
I want to follow up on Diana's earlier comments on your notion of consumer welfare, including those non-price manufacturers. So if you were to replace me on one day, and can you reimagine what kind of the guideline would be to incorporate those kind of non-price factors into the antitrust practice?
Yeah, and don't get me wrong. I've known Lena since she was 24 years old, and she was a journalist, and she came to interview me about airline mergers, and so I followed her through her career. But I'm just going to say, not even Chatham House rules. There's been some misinformation about the scope of the consumer welfare standard. It absolutely can go beyond price effects. And that's all on sort of the anti-competitive effects side of the ledger. If you go to the other side of the ledger and look at efficiencies that might be generated by certain mergers or certain types of conduct, there are more static efficiencies, cost reductions, but there are also more dynamic efficiencies like longer term innovation effects from, scale, R&D scaling up and all that kind of thing. I don't think any of that was in, John can tell me because he worked for Lena, but I don't think any of these concepts were in her information set because, not an economist, was a lawyer, came to be a lawyer late to the game. But to answer your question, yes, these cases can be brought. And I think kudos to the FTC for trying to press on the boundaries and bringing some more novel theories and novel facts and trying to get out of sort of this cramped view of the consumer welfare standard. The problem is, as Brooke accurately said, all the economists have generated 90% of their effort on the price effect side. They just haven't done that much work on the quality side. Like, what is a small but significant non-transitory decrease in quality? If you're looking at sort of the quality parallel to a SNP test in the merger guidelines, that work has not been done. It's maybe in progress. We've struggled with innovation markets, right? That work is in progress. In the Kroger-Albertsons case that just came down, big win on the consumer side. The FTC kind of got dinged on the labor side because they had not. The judge agreed with the market definition, but the judge very pointedly pointed out that the FTC had not done their homework to show how the merger would have an anti-competitive effect in a labor market. So these are all areas of exploration and development. This is why we need more economists and business school people and other multidisciplinary folks to work in this area.
This is maybe one way to think about this idea. Is there's a paper Rebecca Allensworth at Vanderbilt just put out called Long Run Consumer Welfare, where it's like, let's look beyond a kind of static short run view and take into account something like resiliency for a supply shock down the road. I think it's a really nice sophisticated piece, and it helps kind of crystallize like what the agencies had been doing for a while, although they thought it was very sophisticated, actually was pretty static. It was pretty short run. That's how you miss Facebook, Instagram, right? So when you look at a case like Microsoft Activision, we talked about this morning, I think of that, and the paper that Rebecca wrote thinks of that as it's a long run consumer welfare paper. So maybe that kind of captures the idea.
I'm new to academics. My first paper, this is sort of squarely on point. Coming from practice, my reaction to let's throw it all out and come in with a whole new set of objectives is that is totally unfeasible, and that the consumer welfare standard has just been insufficiently tested because of what everyone said already, but that there are a lot of avenues left for testing. That consumer means more than what we have traditionally interpreted it as, both in the law and then in the policy priorities and enforcement objectives of cases like labor is historically grossly underenforced. But monopsonies are just as subject to the antitrust laws as monopolies, and that welfare means significantly more. Welfare is broad enough to encompass long-term risks, broad enough to encompass privacy, quality effects, many things that are untested, and that would be a very fruitful enforcement agenda to expand the scope of those two words.
And I would also add that those effects can be evaluated in any market in the supply chain. We've just gotten through the, debunking, the myth that you have to have an antitrust violation in some upstream market, you have to have a consumer effect down here, like way down there. And, that was the Penguin Simon Schuster case, which DOJ brought, book publishers case, just in the market for commissions paid top authors with no consumer side effect at all. And, we fought that battle, and the progressives fought that battle and won. But, antitrust does not move very quickly. It's rather glacial in its progression and learning.
Yeah. Mario, go ahead.
Oh, I have a question related to before you said that antitrust cannot solve it all, and I kind of agree with that. One thought is, to what extent do you think in the next years, it would be important to have coordination between different kind of authorities. And I think of it like from a geographical standpoint, right? Like, and but also like today we learned that like big tech interact with a young startup throughout the life cycle of the startup, right? So, and I think about IP policy. To what extent do you think that we need this coordination, and where are we right now?
It's the easiest question for an enforcer. We need more coordination. Coordination is great. Yeah, I mean, I think we're at a weird time in geopolitics where we really saw the UK CMA kind of step up to the plate, and they are not even in the batter's box anymore. Sorry for the baseball metaphor.
What's
Um,
the skiing animal?
yeah, they are sitting in the hot.
Short-lived.
Yeah, they're back in the hotel room, hanging out, drinking heavily, probably. Yeah. So, I do think absolutely coordination is essential, and I think to your other point, producing good high quality scholarship like what we've seen today, and packaging it in a way, right? Think of your target audience if you want to write to an enforcer. They're overworked, they're underpaid, they have no time. So packaging it in a way that's easily digestible, I think, is going to be really essential.
I would also add look, if you're an academic and you're doing really important, high value, very valuable academic research, that's great. But get with the policy people. Like, don't just stay in your little academic bubble and in your universities. Get out there and come to conferences like this where you can talk to practitioners and policy people, because that's the way you leverage your work. Right. Otherwise, it sort of dies a quiet death on SSRN, and you don't want that. You want your work to be cited in agency guidelines and agency workshops and all that kind of thing. But to your question about coordination, I think it's vitally important. I think it's taken a big hit, not only for geopolitical reasons that John points out, but also, there was definitely some strategic use of international cooperation under the Biden DOJ and FTC, using sort of international dynamics to slow down deals or force deals to get abandoned. And I'm not sure that's very productive or useful. What is productive and useful is sort of international cartel enforcement, but, that's got its own set of problems. Merger, collaboration on transglobal mergers, that's really important. So I think there's huge opportunity, and it's really important to do that. And certainly when the UK is now, everything is efficiency with the CMA. They've done a complete 180. The Canadians have gotten rid of a lot of their efficiency defenses, and now they are wanting to restructure their whole sort of antitrust approach. So these are big opportunities to talk to enforcers about these concepts.
I'm just gonna, because I know Brooke's got to run to the airport, which you should do. There was an accident on the main road, but it's cleared. So you should be safe. So you should just step out, Brooke. I just want to make a quick plug to chime in on what Diana said, which is policymakers and legislators are going to use something. So you might as well provide them with excellent work, and if you can just package it up to a one-page cover, off you go. Like you'll be able to have that impact.
I'll just give one example because it's relevant to so Tom Woolman's paper was the basis of a monopolization lawsuit against roll-ups, right? Because they're not, covered by the Clayton Act. So, I mean, this can happen and can be really impactful, right? That was significant evidence that the enforcers didn't have of consumer effects.
Yeah. Arjun, go ahead, but Brooke, if you want to step out off, yeah.
It was a pleasure.
Thanks.
I don't know much about the legal side of things, but last year the Chevron doctrine was struck down by the Supreme Court. I just want to know, like, how much would that impact the FTC's work, especially if they're going to be coming up with newer guidelines and what you said about judges, like, they're going to be lower some conservative or more of the Georgia Commission school of planning, are just going to keep ignoring the guidelines, is just doing their own thing as being activist judges and striking down the Chevron ban. The agencies don't have the purview, or like judges have the ultimate authority to decide what's going on in these cases.
Yeah. I mean, I can take a first crack at that.
That's a John Newman question.
Correct what I'm about to say because it'll probably be wrong. Because I'm not an administrative law person, although just about every antitrust lawyer these days also has to be a good administrative law person. So that's just a personal failing. Um, it's not going to be Chevron so much as cases like Axon Enterprises, which has already been decided. That hurt us immensely at the FTC, right? We're supposed to have this in-house court. Lena Khan, like it or not, is supposed to be making law, writing judicial opinions, essentially. It basically made that process unusable. That was a case that was, started out as a 2-to-1 bread and butter horizontal merger case under Joe Simons. So you can get stung any which way these days. Axon's bad. Jarchesi's going to be bad. My view is at some point, though, the FTC is just going to have to take its lumps, like get found unconstitutional, fix the problem. Get found and eventually we'll run out of these, in my view, garbage arguments, and the FTC will start functioning again. But until then, it's bad.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Oh, Josh, one last one. We'll do one last quick one.
So both of you mentioned aspects of kind of dynamic, like pushing consumer welfare out in the future, and then particularly in digital markets, where you have kind of these compounded market failures. And then the further out you look, especially when you're trying to simulate or estimate something forward, you're just going to have this kind of compounded uncertainty, and really anything may happen. And I'm curious, I mean, this may not appear as much of a threat now in terms of how enforcement's done, but what do you see as potentially a path forward to include all these considerations without developing a kind of paralysis in actually bringing this enforcement?
Yeah. So I'm happy to just provide some thoughts on that, because that's a big but very good question. So earlier I said in the day that I feel like, having studied and analyzed the history of merger acquisitions involving the big digital business ecosystems, the GAFAMs, that enforcers kind of they took it slow. I think they took a wait and see approach. They really scrutinized transactions, high rate of second requests, just a very low rate of challenges, like off the map low. And so, was that an error? Was that antitrust conservatism? Was that error cost analysis? Was it the Chicago school still slinging its weight around in the judiciary at the agencies? Probably not. We now know enough to maybe opine that that's not the case. Maybe enforcers were actually kind of being smart and saying, I'm going to see how these digital business ecosystems develop. I'm going to see how innovative they are. By the way, all of this is taking place in a digital sector which has very high levels of total factor productivity and labor productivity. And antitrust doesn't do macroeconomics, but you've got a little explaining to do when you're bringing 5 monopolization cases in a sector that shows off the charts level of total factor and labor productivity. And I'm not saying that we should be changing anything. It's just a fact. It's just sort of a background observation. But the problem is, we ran into this brick wall with all of the monopolization cases, many of which I think have merit. But that, to me, signaled a switch to a very static competition model. So we went from maybe some dynamic competition to static competition. Here's the conundrum. The conundrum is the dynamic competition folks, a lot of what they say actually is very resonant. But here's the $1 million question for antitrust enforcement. How long are we willing to tolerate the exercise of market power before the next new technology comes in and displaces Google search or whatever? How long are we willing to tolerate market power and harm to competitors and harm to consumers? That's the question that nobody has answered. And John, maybe you've got thoughts on this, but
Well, I don't have an answer to that.
that's the existential question.
Yeah, it's characteristically well put. Let me maybe give an example of trying to do that, and it's one that didn't work, and then maybe a potential solution that hasn't been tried much, but I think shows some promise. So an example of kind of trying to do that, I think of as the Microsoft Activision case, right? So although I think Microsoft very, very successfully in the kind of court of public opinion made that a case just about consoles, the old technology, and just about one game, really, Call of Duty. The way we saw it was, this is an industry that's undergoing a paradigm shift, right? It's moving from consoles into the kind of Netflix subscription model. And in that market, Microsoft was not the number 2 struggling to compete, right? They're far and away already the market leader. There's network effects here. We looked at that and said, this developing market is going to develop in a more pro-competitive way if you've got a platform agnostic studio out there cranking out games. Call of Duty's one, but not just that one. We tried it, didn't work so well, right? Potential solution. We tried it under a substantially lessened competition theory. That's the first part of Clayton Act Section 7, kind of our main statute, anti-merger statute. It's the one we've always used. People forget there's a second half. Substantially lessened competition almost seems to invite some kind of quantification of effect. Substantial is a size thing. Quantifying effects in this kind of market, it's like impossible, right? The second part of the statute prohibits mergers that may tend to create a monopoly. Any tendency is enough that could be a potentially useful tool because it lets you move away from the kind of quantification that's a recipe for non-action.
Yeah. Friends, we're a little bit over time on this one, so I thought we would just wrap it up. So if you join me in thanking our panelists and one in absentia, here we are. I'm just going to give you some quick wrap up thoughts. First of all, thanks so much for coming. I will, as you can probably got a sense from my emails, putting the conference together this year was a was a thing. So I greatly appreciate just having you here, kicking this off. The plan is to continue this in subsequent years. I think we'll be able to scale this now that we've got sort of the our feet under ourselves now. Which is all to say, it'd be great to see you again. With new papers, or maybe revised papers, and then with more of your friends and colleagues.